2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Liked it so much, we'll do it again. Another video lecture, this time imperialism in Asia, and why not the Americas? Again, you've seen your map of Africa. You've seen that virtually all of Africa was completely divided up by the time we get to the early 1900s. A little bit less so in Asia. You will notice that there are different colors within India, suggesting that maybe British control was not absolute there in quite the same way it was in parts of Africa. And China, of course, a huge landmass about the same size as the United States, is not formally colonized, but, it is largely under various forms of Western control. We'll get into that in a second. In Asia, we are looking at England, France, the Netherlands, a little bit at Russia, the United States only toward the end of this period, specifically in the Philippines, and interesting, one of these peoples is not like the other, the Japanese. We'll talk about how Japan went from being a subjugated country that had fallen far behind the West, actually becomes a significant imperial power of itself, and that becomes a major story in the 20th century. Notice only about half of Asia is formally under outside control, although, again, that's a little bit misleading because other parts of it are certainly dominated by the West, if not politically controlled by it. With England, we are talking primarily India, although Burma, which is entirely, today's Myanmar, entirely separate state, becomes folded into the Indian Empire, Malaysia, as we call it today, and also influence in parts of the Middle East, Afghanistan, and China as well. The countries of the Middle East, and here we're talking about Saudi Arabia, we are talking about what today is Lebanon and Syria and Palestine, Israel, North Africa. All of these areas are technically sort of still under control of the Ottoman Empire, but the sick man of Europe really doesn't have any real authority, and increasingly the British kind of move in and become more dominant there. You also see, by the way, the Russians in certain areas. We'll talk about that later. So the early days, we have the British East India Company. Remember that this is the period of mercantilism, a mercantile economic system. You might stop the film for a second and say, wait a minute, do I understand what mercantilism was? Again, mercantilism was the idea that the government, generally a king, although in England under more parliamentary control, pretty much determines what is good for the overall economy of the state. Therefore, you would have private industries, private shipping companies, private businesses, but ultimately there were some restrictions on what they can do. Is your private enterprise benefiting the kingship, benefiting the state? If so, we will support it. So the British East India Company is a private trading company, not owned by the British government. It is a joint stock company, meaning there is no one owner but multiple investors. But the British government says, wait a minute, you folks, as you begin to develop, are bringing more and more of the world's wealth into England. You'd better believe we support you folks. It was formed officially in 1600 and little by little became the dominant force in India. 1757 is a key date, and I don't know much about it, but the Battle of Plassey. And this is basically the Mughal Empire's army against an army not of England, but a private army formed by the British East India Company. The emperor's army is defeated. And for the next century, it's not illegitimate to say that England, or the British East India Company, really is the source of most political and economic power in India. Now, it's not 100%. There is still an emperor, and also India, unlike China, incredibly diverse. And remember, in China, 90% of the population is ethnic Han Chinese. In India, there are dozens. At this point, I'm sure hundreds of different languages and very great diversity in terms of religion. So you had areas under more or less British East India Company control. 1756, as you might recall, is the beginning of that 7 Years' War, and that's pretty critical. This is where Britain wins, France is defeated. The French, who had major interest in India, are pushed out. The Portuguese do retain a couple of trading posts, but of course their day in the sun is over. Basically, we are talking about British control of India pretty absolutely from the mid 18th century. And then, by the way, you see the closing date, 1858 is where England actually makes India a formal part of the British Empire. And this is why. This is called the Sepoy Rebellion. Sepoy, by the way, is a color. You might have a sepia tone on your camera. It means brown, more or less. It is also called sometimes the Great War of Independence, or the First War of Independence, or sometimes called the Great Rebellion. Now, you might say it's three different names. What's the point? But think for a moment, the difference between a war and a rebellion. And of course, a rebellion suggests that there is a legitimate established authority. Who was in charge? Well, the British, of course. And the Indians rebelled. Now, the difference between the sepoy, those darker skinned soldiers rebelling, and the Great Rebellion, well, that makes a difference. But there are also Indian historians or pro-Indian historians who argue, you know what this is? This isn't a rebellion. This is a widespread war to declare Indian independence. Now, it doesn't work. It's not successful, but this is the first step in what eventually happened 90 years later. I think you know about the story. It's animal fat, the Enfield rifles. You had to store the bullet cartridges in fat of some sort to keep them moist, stop them from drying off. Rumors came about that there was either pig fat, which would be unacceptable for a Muslim soldier in the British military, or it was perhaps cow fat, which would be equally unacceptable for the Hindu fighter. Remember, the British have a relatively small number of people in India. Most of the army is Indian. Trained Indian bureaucrats, military folks, especially officials, especially soldiers. Yes, the top officers were generally British, of course. But they depend upon Indians to police themselves. And by the way, Indians are taxed to pay for the own army to keep themselves subjugated. You'll notice that I said in terms of causes, look, animal fat is not going to lead to a rebellion that has 6 months like this. There was clear unhappiness, clear frustration in India. This was the spark more than anything else. You will notice that it does not lead to a whole country rebellion. So I think perhaps calling this the First War of Independence, I think is maybe a little bit more, too much wishful thinking perhaps, or maybe overemphasizing it. But it's by no means just a little skirmish where some soldiers got unhappy. There were 6 months of fighting, of horrible behavior on both sides, and the British absolutely to crack this down. They are willing, they execute Indian rebels by the thousands sometimes, hanging them up by trees, covering a whole orchard, that type of thing. Well, the British government noticed that the British East India Company began in 1600, the mercantile area. Well, things have changed. Adam Smith wrote his book in 1776. Laissez-faire capitalism is the goal of Great Britain, free markets. The idea that the British government would need to control a group like the British East India Company. You know what? That's very 17th century. And look, the stakes are high. This is so tremendously important that we British keep India and we keep them controlled. We keep the economic profits coming in. We really don't need this outdated middleman. The British East India Company is abolished. The British take direct control, and it is the end of the Mughal Empire. The final emperor is exiled to Myanmar, to Yangon, where I used to live. I've been to his tomb once, and it is the end of the Mughal Empire. About 20 years later, Queen Victoria, this is called the Victorian Age in Britain. You're going to hear later about the Great Victorian Holocaust. She was the monarch, the Queen of England from 1837 to 1901, and this is the period where England becomes the dominant power of the world. Well, 1877, there is a formal ceremony. She is named the Empress of India. India is simply a chunk of territory that belongs to the British. What we have here is a couple of views of this 1857 rebellion. I'd like you to stop the film, read through this, and then determine what's the main story here according to this view, and what's the importance of it? What are the consequences of this rebellion? So stop, please, read, think. Now, one thing you will notice is there is a lot of information about pig fat, cow fat, etc., etc. That takes up a big chunk of this. You notice that there is nastiness with Europeans being killed mercilessly, and the British troops are willing to be ruthless back, you see toward the bottom. And then you'll also notice, what is the impact of this? Okay, this happened, so what? Well, look at that last sentence. Took direct control of India and reorganized the army. That's the story. And you know what? None of this is wrong. Absolutely none of this is incorrect. Let's take a look at what an Indian historian wrote of the same period. And again, read, ask yourself, where is the focus? What does it say about animal fat, beef fat, cow fat, etc., etc., and why is it important? Stop the film, read, and think. You notice there's a trick question there. Did it say anything about cow fat? Did it say anything about pig fat? It does mention, oh, okay, the most immediate consequence was a military reorganization. Got it. But if you read through this, what does this author see as the meaning of this rebellion? Why is it important? Well, you look at the last few lines, that there is now no sense that the British really belong here. The British government does not honor the Queen's promises. After 1857, according to this author, the nationalist movement started to expand in the hearts of more and more Indians. In other words, what's important about this? It is the First Great War of Independence or the Great Rebellion. It is not a mutiny or rebellion of sepoys, of Indian soldiers. Pretty important. 40% of the land and 25% of the population was controlled by Rajas, by local princes, etc. Oh, the Brits had the ultimate decision, but the British did not send millions of British people to run the giant land of India. They relied upon local elites. They gave them wealth, status, power, a certain degree of autonomy, as long as the money is coming in and orders being kept. So you have at absolute maximum maybe 100,000 British people, and usually a lot less, controlling about 250 million Indians, and that's done with cooperation, collaboration from Indians. Really important. Remember, as Napoleon said, England is a nation of shopkeepers. All they do is export their goods with their giant industrial machinery. Well, 20% of what England sells goes to India. That's pretty important. They get the cotton, raw materials at very, very cheap prices. And Indians pay taxes, a lot, an estimated 10 billion pounds of silver a year for the cost of the government. The Indians, through their taxation, not only do they have to sell their cotton cheaper, and not only are they forced to buy British imports of clothing, they're also being taxed fairly heavily to pay for the upkeep of the British government. When I say emotional importance to England, this is not justifying it, but it becomes, if you are a loyal, patriotic Brit, you absolutely consider India to be a part of your empire. I think I've mentioned in class that upper middle class and wealthy young men, they did their India time. It's just simply what young people of privilege did. They served in the government, they did business. It just is a part of the British experience. Worth noting that in the years following the rebellion in 1857, 1858, you start seeing stronger nationalist movements. And by the way, it's a small world. The fact that European countries, populations, that Greece and Serbia have already become independent, that you start seeing independent movements in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so forth, well, the Indians are aware of this. So you start seeing a movement toward a more nationalistic pro-Indian population. What you see is a group called the Indian National Congress, and that is still a political party today. Notice that when they are formed in 1885, they are not calling for independence. In fact, the first two presidents of the Indian National Congress are British men who are there speaking on behalf of the Indians. Initially, what they're calling for is more rights, more representation, a stronger role for Indians, but not necessarily for independence. The first time the Indian National Congress mentions this is in 1905. And by the way, there's a war that concludes in 1895 in Asia. We'll come back to that. I've never made the connection before, but the fact that maybe Indians are still openly calling for independence in 1905 may be as a result of what happened in a 1904-1905 war in another part of Asia. We'll get to it. By the way, kind of interesting, there is another group that forms in 1906, an independence or a nationalist group called the Muslim League. Now, I want to point out that the founders of the Muslim League were not opposed to the Indian National Congress. Members of the Muslim League were generally members of both groups. So they worked for increased rights, better treatment, perhaps independence, both as Indians and as Muslims. At the early point, there is little conflict between the Congress and the League. However, you are seeing the birth of a separate India and Pakistan after World War II. You know, make a point, one of the things that Hitler did so effective in Germany is that he started educating younger children, ages 3, 4, 5, in Nazi ideology. So the point when they become adults, they don't question. This is an alphabet book for young children, and you can do some of the reading here. You will notice, and I always ask you the prom date question, the W. W is the word of an Englishman true. When given it means what he says he will do. Now, I don't suspect that this gentleman here is anybody's ideal prom date, the British man here. However, he is clearly sophisticated, and he is clearly intelligent, and he is well-dressed, and my God, look who he's talking to. Is that a human being, or is that a jungle animal? Oh, Lord, he's wearing a hat with a feather. He thinks he's important. You know, you've got to think, if 4 or 5-year-old kids are reading this without even thinking about it, before they can think, what is their view of the relationship between them, the British, and the African people, the Indian people? Well, we are sophisticated, honest, pure, decent, civilized. They are half devil, half child. Well, yes, that's racism, of course. Just a few of the images, and you can just stop and look at these. It's clearly a different time. We don't over-romanticize by any means the empire, but again, different time, different place, pretty dramatic photographs. Relatively little to say about the French in this time period. The French do. They recognize, we are losing Asia. We have lost all of our holdings in India. China is far too powerful. We're talking the early 1800s, etc. They begin to move into what we call Indochina. Today, these are the modern-day countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, parts of Southeast Asia. And by the 1880s, they are largely under French control. I want to point out that Siam, Thailand, remains independent. I had a student a couple years ago did a really good paper about this, in which she pointed out that there was really, really effective leadership in Thailand, where they recognized the need to compromise, to play the British in India to the west, off the French in Indochina to the east, and largely played games with both the major powers. And it was sort of agreed by the British and French to allow Siam to remain independent. Why? As a buffer state, because then you don't have England's empire and France's empire bordering against each other with the possibility of conflict. So that's largely why Thailand was allowed to remain independent, and Thais today are very proud of this. They were not subjugated to the degree that the others in Asia were. I love this. This will make you cry. And I'm going to read this to you rather than have you do it. I believe we've mentioned this, but look, the British industrial empire is starting to grow. The factories are appearing. This is 50, 60 years after Watt's steam engine and all these power looms, and the Industrial Revolution is really starting to kick in. Quite naturally, the British are very interested in Chinese trade. After all, 400 million Chinese people, Absolutely. Now, you know that the Chinese would have no interest at all whatsoever. They had closed off from the barbarians 300 years ago. Well, the British king, King George III, same one as during the American Revolution, sends an ambassador, Admiral Macaulay, I believe his name was, and it's a message to the Qinglong Emperor. The Qinglong is the name of the emperor from the Qing Empire, and in effect says, hey, Emperor, we know that you folks want to be cut off, but why don't we start trading more with each other? You know, Adam Smith and others have shown how it can be mutually beneficial. We produce some great materials, you produce some great stuff, it will benefit both of us. Why don't you open up your ports and we'll start a strong trade reaction? Well, here is the written response from the Qinglong Emperor. You, O king, from afar, have yearned after the blessings of our civilization, and in your eagerness to come into touch with our converting influence, have sent an embassy, an ambassador, across the sea bearing a memorial. I have already taken note of your respectful spirit of submission and have treated your mission with extreme favor. I've given you gifts. I've allowed you to come here. My indulgence has been manifested. Notice, wow, you want to hang out with us, the Chinese? You know, we thought you were really stupid, ignorant barbarians, but I gotta say, I'm a little surprised that you recognized how awesome and superior we are. You know what? We'll give you a little pat on the head for not being completely stupid. But my indulgence, my tolerance, has been shown. Continuing. Yesterday, your ambassador petitioned my ministers to memorialize me regarding trade with China. But this proposal is not consistent with our usage and cannot be entertained. All European nations, including your own country's barbarian merchants, have carried on their trade with our empire at Canton, the one Chinese city that took trade. That's been the procedure, and that's what's going to happen. Although our empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks absolutely nothing that we need, there is, therefore, no need to import the manufactures, the useless junk from outside barbarians. Good day, sir. Good day. In effect, England, let's trade more. The Qinglong Emperor, why on earth would we want to trade with stinky, pathetic little barbarian you? Goodbye. The Chinese very much believe, as they have believed for centuries, and generally rightly, that they were more powerful, more advanced, more technologically superior in virtually every way. At 1793, this wasn't necessarily the case, although the Chinese don't know it. By the 1840s, it becomes abundantly clear industrialized Western Europe has moved far ahead of China. So we have the Qing dynasty. Remember, these are the Manchurians. They're outsiders. They're not Chinese. But you know what? As long as things are stable, as long as China is prospering, population is growing, territory is growing, times are generally speaking pretty good. Well, clearly, the Qing, the foreigners, the Manchus, must have the, yes, mandate of heaven, and most Chinese are willing to accept this. England is the dominant naval power, of course, and they want the 400 million customers. Now, wait a minute. China, most Chinese people are poor. The peasants are poor. 90% couldn't afford British goods. But 10% of 400 million? That's 40 million potential customers. But here's the problem. As the Qinglong Emperor made quite abundant, England offers absolutely nothing that China could want. Except, drum roll please, opium. It's heroin. It's an addictive, highly addictive opiate. It becomes problematic. We'll talk maybe in class a little bit about the effects of opium, of heroin, but it is highly physically addictive, And the numbers are not solid, but a significant portion, tens of millions of Chinese opium addicts are running about the country. The Qing government tries to stop it, as the opium, which is grown mainly in Burma, in India at this point, a little bit in Afghanistan, well, mostly in Afghanistan today, but that's not where it's coming in from. British free traders are starting to bring it into China to sell it. Well, the Qing government bans it. A statement from the government: opium has a very violent effect. When an addict smokes it, it rapidly makes him extremely excited, capable of doing anything. It kills him. It's a poison. It's destroying us. But demand continues. And you look at these numbers, you are seeing a 100-fold increase coming mainly from British India by the 1830s. The Qings again attempt to cut off the opium trade. Anybody caught with opium receives the death penalty. The Qings attack a British trade vessel loaded with opium, and this is the excuse. The British say, we are now declaring war on India. Remember, British are free market capitalists. Who is the government of China to put restrictions on what our private merchants may or may not trade? Now, I think in this room today, and certainly the Chinese at the time were saying, you are bringing in a poison that is destroying the lives of tens of millions of Chinese people. The British are saying, you are not allowed to interfere with our free market. There are actually a series of wars. It's not the Opium War. It's a series. But what do we have? Modern industrialized Britain with modern military, with machine guns, against a China that had been so cut off. They're still fighting like a 15th century army. Bottom line, China, which had long assumed itself to be greatly superior in every way, is absolutely destroyed. Now, the British could consider coming in and taking over all of China. But first of all, it's a huge part of land, and Britain doesn't have the resources. Secondly, you would have to assume that the other European powers would not be very comfortable watching England try to solely take over China. So China simply is forced to sign a series of treaties. They're called the treaties, again, plurals. It's a series of them, but the Treaty of Nanjing. Hong Kong becomes a part of England. That remains true until 1999. China has to pay 21 million ounces of silver to pay back England for the costs of the war. New ports are opened, and officially and unofficially, China is divided up into areas where the British government and later other European governments and Japan have areas where they basically make the economic and political decisions without formally taking it over. By the way, there is one additional thing I did not include, and that's called a policy of extraterritoriality. And the Chinese had to agree, if a British person commits a crime in China, the Chinese government has absolutely no authority to bring them to trial. It's the job of the British. So if I am a British trader and I kill 3 Chinese children, the Chinese government has to sign a treaty saying, that's none of our business. We hope England will take care of it. Obviously, this suggests a few things: the dominant power of England at this point, how China has fallen, and, of course, deeply humiliating for the Chinese. By the way, what might you assume if you were a Chinese person who had been reasonably happy with the Qing Empire? Would you think that perhaps the Chinese Empire, the Qing Empire, has lost that mandate of heaven? You probably might. And if you were to see an earthquake coming up soon, or a flood, or a major rebellion, that might lead to more of a sense that the heavens have withdrawn their mandate. Here are, as I say, the spheres of influence. Again, this is official and unofficial, but these are areas controlled by the Russians. This is by 1900 or so. The Russians, the British, the French, the Germans, the Japanese. You might notice that the Americans are not here. The United States is pushing for what they call an open door policy. And the open door policy would suggest that, wait a minute, we shouldn't have spheres of influence. This should be first come, first served, open business, kind of a Congo Free State type thing. Hey, you might notice also that there are numerous rebellions in this area. There are Muslim rebellions. Remember, there are more Chinese Muslims today than Saudi Arabian Muslims because it is a huge country. The most significant is the Taiping Rebellion. And you'll see on this little map in the upper left, on the upper left of the slide, you'll see that huge parts of the country were taken over by the Taiping. Taiping's pretty fascinating. An idea of gender equality, an idea of economic equality, founded by a frustrated Confucian exam taker who had failed repeatedly, who lapsed into a coma and came out saying, "I just visited heaven. It turns out that I am Jesus Christ's brother." This is Hong Shi-Kwang, his name was. And probably not because he was so charismatic that absolutely everybody believed in this area that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. Probably more, he was a charismatic leader in a population that is deeply dissatisfied with the government. This rebellion is eventually put down, but it lasts 15 years. And there's a sense, by the way, that the consensus is that probably 25 million people died as a result of this rebellion, cut off in food supplies, disorder, violence, etc., etc., etc. Quite clearly, by 1900, China is not a dominant power any longer. So taking a quick look at the end, this is China during the 19th century. Again, 400 million people, 25% of the world's population, and each one of those people, or even the wealthiest 10%, could be customers. Could not be colonized directly like the Dutch East Indies, like the Malay states, like the various states in Africa. It was just huge. It was powerful. It was more developed government, society, 2,000 years of, well, more than that, of unity, connection, etc. So large, so powerful. And again, here comes my fist for your head, the balance of power. If England were to try to take over all of China, they would probably be looking eventually at war with France, with Germany, etc., etc. So all these agreements are signed with European powers. They were forced. They were at gunpoint. The Qing Emperor, of course, was humiliated by this. He had no choice. China is divided into zones of influence. And again, the United States, kind of late to the game. Wait a minute. We want to have an open door policy. That's what we want to do. In other words, anybody can trade a Chinese free state, as it were. One of the uglier and lesser known. We're going to, I hope, read something about this later, but Mike Davis, an historian, calls this the late Victorian Holocaust. Now, on one hand, it is climate related. The El Nino wind patterns, which I don't understand that well, basically meant massive, massive droughts. And yes, people starving to death. You see the numbers on both sides of the Pacific. 15, 20 million in Asia, 30, 40 million, 50, maybe 60 million altogether. Yes, it is a natural disaster, absolutely. But, and this might sound a little disjointed. You might have heard a bell ring and I had to discontinue this and come back to it a couple hours later. But I think I was talking about how this massive famine that, again, probably killed 30, 40 million people. Sure, some of it was environmental, and not just environmental destruction, but weather patterns, droughts, rainfall, etc. But the thing that is particularly shocking, and that Mike Davis revealed, is that it was also policy that killed. The British were very well aware that India, which they controlled, this was their responsibility for these people. They were aware that people were starving by the millions, by the tens of millions. And they simply said, well, it would be wrong to give them food because that would interfere with the free market. There was food that was being exported from India as people were starving. The food was not getting to them. Reluctantly, the British began to set up work situations. Well, we'll feed you, but you've got to work on the railroad, do manual labor. Needless to say, that is killing people by the tens of thousands, people that are literally gone weeks without food expected to work on the railroad. Again, the numbers are horrifying. The images, of course, are horrifying. And one of the things, I think we have a tendency in Western countries to say, well, certainly the British made mistakes, the Americans have made mistakes, but the intentions were always good, of course. And I think it's fairly hard to buy that. Under the Mughal Empire, there simply were not famines. Now, there were certainly inequality, there was injustice, people went hungry, there probably were, well, there were minor famines, but never a situation like this in which literally millions and millions of people dying. There was always something set up. It was understood to be the government's responsibility to step in, and that was certainly true in China as well. Well, under the free market in this case, the obligation is to this thing called the market. And yeah, it was conscious policy to allow millions of people to die. And this also happened in Ireland, by the way, happened in India during World War II under Winston Churchill. He was well aware that not providing food to people would lead to probably and did millions of deaths. But that's what we need to do in the name of civilization. Once again, we've seen this about 42 times, so we don't need to see it a 43rd. Here is the exception to the rule. Now, China is a little bit of an exception because it was never actually directly controlled by a European power. Japan even more so. You recall that Japan used to be an isolated feudal society and then had a shogun. The shogun is basically the military leader, the king that had his armies of samurais that basically had the divine emperor that in name only was there. This is the Tokugawa shogunate starting in the early 1600s. By all means, it is a prosperous time. Japan's population grows, its food production grows. It's a good time for Japan, but the Japanese, who are famous as being borrowers from other societies, they also copied what the Chinese had earlier done by closing off Japanese ports. You might remember that the Dutch were able to bring one ship in a year legally at Nagasaki. Christmas Day is when it was allowed to unload. It wasn't complete isolation. Ideas were getting in, foods were getting in, people were traveling, but it was pretty close. Much like with China, as the rest of Western Europe, as the West begins to grow, as the United States develops, changes, Japan kind of stayed ossified, stayed stone-like. Not a great deal of change in technology, society, economy, military, etc. from 1600 to 1800. So the West comes knocking. Commodore Matthew Perry, an American actually, Commodore is a military person from the Navy. Americans show up in 1853, and they basically say, look, we want to trade with you and use Japan as a trading port, partly for the lucres of Japan, but also to have access to China. And the Japanese under the Tokugawa say, well, no, we keep outsiders out. The Americans are pretty clear, look, this is not really a request, this is a demand. We'll be back in 6 months, we expect the ports to be opened. And the Japanese are not fools. The Japanese realized that little tiny England managed to virtually conquer mighty, powerful China just to the west. Well, you know what? We're going to have to agree with it. The Japanese open up their ports. Americans come in, the English come in, the French come in. This leads to a crisis in Japanese society. Now, we've talked about how in the Ottoman Empire, the Tanzimat reforms really didn't get much of anywhere. China, I believe, had what they called the self-strengthening movement. The idea of modernizing China didn't really get much of anywhere. It does in Japan. A group of southern nobles, the daimyo, overthrow the Tokugawas in 1868. And they put a new emperor on the throne, Emperor Mutsuhito. He's a different type of leader. He is not happy to sit quietly on a throne and smile and have people give him gifts. He decides to help create a different Japan. And, you know, honestly, the Japanese, with their long history of borrowing what works from other societies, the Japanese ask themselves, they say, look, we should be on the top of the world. We should be a dominant country. After all, we are the children of the sun god. We are the greatest people in the world. And let's be honest, it's 1868 and we are on our knees. Well, let's look around the world. What societies are now dominant? England, Germany, Belgium, the United States. Well, what do they have in common? Well, number one, they appear to have democratic governments, or at least a republic. And there is a theory behind this that if people are electing their own representatives, it makes them more invested. So Japan moves to that reform. More importantly, they are industrialized. they are producing types of wealth that no agricultural traditional society could do. So the Japanese embark on what is called the greatest crash course industrialization project in world history. And I'll tell you, within a couple of decades, Japan goes from being a impressive 17th century power to being a true power. They go to war with China in 1895. Now, China has seen better days. Still, this is China. The Japanese win. And then they go to war with Russia in 1905. And you know what? They win. This is one of the huge events in world history, in modern history. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. I don't know much about the military of it. It's not what interests me as much. But the bottom line is little tiny Japan that 30 years ago was kind of on its knees, a medieval feudal society with a shogun agricultural, has managed to defeat this huge European power. The shockwaves from this reverberate around the world. Step number one, you see that Japan, hey, they're an industrial power. There's no question. The Russians, who had been trying to expand into Asia, realize they can't do this, and they turn and focus more on their traditional areas of strength, the so-called Balkan area with the Slavic populations, like Serbia, like Croatia, etc. Real interesting. Their newfound focus as of 1905 on the Balkans leads Russia to take a very active role when an archduke is assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914. Guys, that's World War I. The Tsar himself, man, this looks weak. And in fact, there is a major 1905 revolt against the Tsar. It fails. The Tsar maintains power, but he is weakened. And after World War I breaks out, 3 years into it, the Tsar is successfully overthrown by the Bolsheviks. And even beyond the impact on Japan and Russia, the inspiration that this sets, white people have been defeated by non-white people. All across Asia, nationalist movements grow. I already mentioned that a year later, the Indian National Congress is calling for an independent India. You are seeing nationalist movements in Indonesia, in Malaysia, honestly, throughout Asia, because the example's been set. And even as far as Africa, it's not quite as direct. You start seeing that small, educated African elite saying, you know what? European whites can be defeated. So this war absolutely changes the world. And another map of Asia. I'm going to go very quickly through this. It was a lot more detailed for my Indonesian students when I was there. In fact, I decided to re-record this lecture because I had devoted a lot more time because it was of interest. There is a group called the Dutch East India Company. It's actually abbreviated VOC for the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, or however it is the Dutch talk. It's a very strange language. Same as the British East India Company, formed around the same time, private trading company, but the mercantilist Dutch government says, absolutely, we'll help you build up, we'll allow you to raise armies, you can build forts, you can sign treaties. From about 1800, from moving into small areas, controlling the spice trade, etc., starts to take over as much as they can of the Indonesian islands from about 1800. Interestingly, there was the French actually take over in the 1800s. Why? Because the Netherlands had been conquered by Napoleon. Once Napoleon is defeated, the British come in again, and they work out a treaty with the Dutch, which say, fine, what you call the Dutch East Indies, today's modern-day Indonesia, that's yours. We get the Malay states, today's Malaysia. So Malaysia colonized by the British, Indonesia by the Dutch. Whole bunch of conquests of war. Remember that Indonesia is not a chunk of land. It's something like, I want to say 20,000 distinct islands, of which 4,000 have some population or something like that. So it's a bit-by-bit area. Java, the central island, is conquered in the 5-year war. Bali, which is a Hindu island that many of you may know as a vacation spot, is conquered. And then there is a 40-year war of the very traditional Islamic area of Aceh, which is on Sumatra. Bottom line is it does take 100 years to really create an Indonesia. Indonesia as a concept did not exist. People from Sumatra and Aceh didn't see themselves as in any way connected to the Javanese, to the Balinese, to etc., etc. So actually, the Dutch create a sense of Indonesia. The Dutch begin, once they establish their control, to set up two different programs. First, we have, and you've read about this, the cultivation system. Bottom line, the Dutch are not there for fun. They're not, oh, they talk about civilizing, but that's not why they're there. They're there for profit. And so they set up a system by which 20% of all land that is in Indonesia, in Java, must be. Once again, this might be an awkward transition. I just got interrupted again, but which is fine. But as I said, the cultivation system, because the Dutch wanted to make money. And what makes money? Well, it's not going to be beans and it's not going to be vegetables and stuff like that. It's going to be coffee, tea, rubber, tobacco, sugar. What do those five have in common? They don't provide nutrition. None of them. Well, the cultivation system said that 20% of all land on the central island of Java needed to be devoted to these things. Basically meant that about 1 billion guilders, I don't know how much a guilder is. You can think of it as a franc or a pound or a dollar, and it may be more or less. The point is, an incredible amount of money. How did the Netherlands become wealthy? Well, 25% of their economy came from this cultivation policy in Indonesia. Problem? Widespread famine. Java, because it is agriculturally really fertile, basically had never ever had a problem with mass famine. This leads to huge amounts of famine. Now think about where we are in 1901. Some things have changed. There is now an anti-imperialist league. This is a worldwide group of people saying it's not right for Europeans and Westerners to be controlling. Hey, by 1901, reports were coming out of the Congo. Reports were coming out of all of these European colonies suggesting that, man, this is brutal. This is horrible treatment. So because there's a lot of pressure in Indonesia on the government to start doing better by Indonesian people. Yes, it's a human rights movement. The government announces the ethical policy. Ethical, meaning moral. It's right. There begins to be a sense of we can't just take from Indonesians. We've got to give something back. Schools, irrigation, migration from the really crowded capital. Interesting, though, once you start educating people in a country in a European language, and they start to be able to read, and they start learning about Enlightenment ideas, and they become more aware, well, that's going to very possibly and does lead toward a nationalist movement. In effect, there is a small population in Indonesia that is empowered and educated enough to start fighting back against the Dutch. Great old photographs. Batavia is the modern-day capital of Jakarta. This is interesting because this is, well, look at this for a second. Tell me what you assume about this family. If you said that they're probably not poor, you're right. This is an elite Indonesian family. If you say that they probably have some Western influence, notice the neckties, notice the clothes, notice the shoes, you're right. This is probably part of that middle class, now educated in Dutch population that basically are the next generations of independence leaders. They've learned from the Dutch how to defeat the Dutch. That's not the Dutch intention, but that's what happens. Again, you're seeing that it's not an all-in-one, the Dutch move in and take over Indonesia. It's not to the 1920s that you really got a clear sense of the Indonesia we call it today. And very quickly, she was in your book already, but it's worth mentioning Kartini. Kartini was an Indonesian woman, dies at the age of 25. I think you can pretty much just read about her here, but she's interesting. She's a modernist. She's a feminist. She dies during childbirth, which is sort of random. There's actually April 21st in Indonesian schools is a holiday. It's Kartini Day. She had written to a bunch of Dutch friends talking about the rights of women, the fact that polygamy, which was still practiced in Indonesia, is wrong. Yeah, just kind of an interesting character. And again, if you were living in Indonesia, you would know this name from very early on. And this is just kind of interesting because this is the Youth Pledge. Keep in mind that the ethical policy began about 30 years earlier. I won't try to read this to you in Indonesian, although it used to make some sense to me. But notice what the pledge that the young, obviously Western educated, fairly elite Indonesians, they're calling for independence. We are the sons and daughters of Indonesia, and we acknowledge one motherland, Indonesia. In other words, not Java, not Sumatra, no, Indonesia. Secondly, we acknowledge one nation, Indonesia. Thirdly, we will uphold the one language, Indonesian. That's kind of important because a majority of people in Indonesia were Javanese. The Javanese language is incredibly complicated, and many of these independence leaders, probably most of whom were from Java, said, look, if we're going to have one nation of Indonesia and be united as we fight for independence, we can't use this elite language and leave people out. So the Indonesian language is one of the easiest in the world to learn. There is basically no grammar. My Indonesian teacher, very serious guy, said, yeah, don't worry about grammar as long as you get the words out. And that was intentionally done to create a simple language that everybody, no matter where they're from, could use. I always thought that was pretty interesting. Finally, the United States. Yes, an imperial power, a little bit different. Take a quick look at this little cartoon. What's going on? And you might notice that Uncle Sam, the United States in the shape of the United States, is actually eating a little fish, and that fish is Cuba. Aha, very clever, huh? Interestingly, it starts in the United States. Now, in the Philippines, Spain had lost most of its colonies, except, of course, for Cuba and also for the Philippines. The United States was supposedly deeply concerned about the rights of Cubans in Cuba and actually began an attack upon Spain in the Philippines. Initially, the United States was very clear. This man, Emilio Aguinaldo, who was sort of the George Washington or Bolivar of his country, the United States said, oh, we are definitely supporting the Filipino people under their leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, to gain independence from Spain. When the United States defeated Spain, it's called the Spanish-American War, it lasted a couple of months, well, the Filipinos set up their own government. However, the next year the United States sent in troops to say, you know what, we are taking over the Philippines. This set up a 4-year civil war. The numbers aren't known, but probably 250,000 to 500,000 or more Filipinos are killed. It is specifically a war on civilians. Housing areas are bombed. Really, this is some of the worst warfare of the time period, and it created a massive anti-imperialist backlash in the United States. How dare we do this? The United States does win this, though, puts down the rebellion, and the Philippines is a U.S. territory till 1946. That's why Filipinos, like my wife, they speak English fluently. Most of them speak some, all of them speak some, many of them speak a lot, many of them are absolutely fluent. Incidentally, when President William McKinley of the United States was talking about the Philippines in 1897, said, I cannot speak of forcible annexation. That cannot be thought of. For us to take over the Philippines would simply be criminal aggression. In 1898, as the United States is fighting Spain in the Philippines, Admiral Dewey says, our Constitution does not permit us to expand outside of America. The Filipinos can be assured of their independence. Yet 3 years later, the same Admiral Dewey speaks a little more honestly. I never treated independence leader Aguinaldo as my ally. He was just there to assist me in my operations against the Spaniards. So, certainly a hypocrisy there. After the United States re-entered, the United States announced to the Filipino people, the supremacy of the United States must and will be enforced throughout every part of the Philippines. Those who resist it can accomplish no other end than their own destruction. Related to this is the so-called Monroe Doctrine, President James Monroe, President of the United States. Keep in mind that the Latin American revolutions happened, the Bolivarian revolutions. By 1823, there were already independent countries in the Americas, and by 1825, the Spanish had been driven out of South America entirely. This is a unilateral statement. The United States simply says, we, the United States, will stop any European country from coming into the Western Hemisphere. Hey, Bolivia is now an independent country. If the British attempt to send military troops to Bolivia, we're going to stop that. Oh, and by the way, if there are problems, if there are conflicts in Europe, the United States will not get involved. I want to point out that this is not an agreement with the countries of South America, with the new governments. This is a statement the United States makes. We will take control over Latin America. Now, the United States does not put its name on Mexico. It does not make Bolivia the 51st state, or at that point an earlier state. It simply means that if the United States does not want these countries dealing with other countries, we have the right to do it. And then about 80 years later, we have the Roosevelt, this is Theodore Roosevelt, corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. A corollary is an addition. Now, the Monroe Doctrine said, if England or France tries to come into South America, we'll stop them. This goes a step further. It says that if the United States is not happy with what's going on within any country in the Western Hemisphere, we will invade. We will intervene, I should say. If we don't like the government of Cuba, we have a right to remove it. If we don't like the policy of the Bolivian government, we can get rid of that government. I want to point out, again, this is not a treaty. Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, none of the countries sign on to this. The United States is saying, we are powerful. We will do what we need to do. Does the United States intervene in Latin America during the next century? Well, quite clearly. It happens in South America as well, but just look at the Caribbean and Central America. The United States sends troops to Mexico under numerous occasions. In Nicaragua, the United States has an occupation for 13 years and then 7 years more. Haiti, that we've already talked to, the United States goes in and occupies 1915 to 1934. The other half of the island, the Dominican Republic, the United States occupies it. If debts are not paid back, in Cuba, the United States is repeatedly intervening. If debts are not paid back, if we don't like the government, if the policies, economic or otherwise, are not up to our desires, we simply send people in. We send in military. And this is quite a statement. First of all, the name, General Smedley Butler. Yes, if I ever have a son, I will name him Smedley Zeger, because Smedley is just an awesome name. Well, this was an American military man who was involved in most of those military interventions you said. And 20 years later, reflecting back, he recognized what he was a part of. He said, and I quote, and I'll read this to you, you can read along. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in everything from second lieutenant to major general. And during the period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a criminal for capitalism. So I helped to make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I led a military force and helped to make Haiti and Cuba a decent pace for the National City Bank to collect revenues in. I helped to purify, using the military, Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I was involved in making the Dominican Republic safe for American sugar interests in 1916, and I helped to make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. He obviously sees himself as not bringing freedom to the Dominican people, to the Cuban people, to the Mexican people, but protecting American business interests. And by the way, a lot of the hostility toward the United States that you find in Latin America, well, they're aware of this history. Finally, here is the world. Hypothetically, if you wanted to go from California on the East Coast all the way to Africa or Europe, what would you need to do? Well, you'd need to go all the way around the southern part of South America and all the way back up north to get to Europe. Taking a closer look, here we have South Latin America, Mexico, Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, and South America. But notice that American ships could not make it through this land. The solution? Here. The United States builds a canal in the early 1900s through Panama. This allows ships from California to go to Panama through the canal and directly to Europe. Cuts the trip time by about 2/3. There's a little problem with it. Panama was a part of the country of Colombia. It was not a separate entity. The United States said, hey, Colombia, we want to build a canal. And Colombia said, we don't want to do it. Well, the United States has got some choices. It could invade Colombia, overthrow the government, and forcefully build a canal. But you know what? That wouldn't look good. Here's what the United States does. There are a group of people, independence rebels, that call themselves Panamanian. And the United States supports these rebels. They send them arms. In fact, the United States sends warships off the coast of Panama so that when the Colombian Navy comes to protect its land, they're not able to do this. Who do you think wins this independence revolution? An independent Panama is created. And what do you think Panama says when the United States says, we'd like to build this canal? They agree to do it. And the United States is able to build its canal. Think about this. An ocean, the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, the force of that kept out by modern engineering, building a hole in the land that will allow the water to fall through. It's a pretty amazing engineering feat, especially for 120 years ago, for sure. We're going to look at a couple of political cartoons on the way out. This is Theodore Roosevelt, the Roosevelt corollary, the American president. When Congress debated, I just took the canal. Theodore Roosevelt, you'll see in this cartoon over on the left, he often said, speak softly and carry a big stick. Well, what was the big stick? Basically forcing that independence on Panama and getting his canal. Take a look at what you see on the right. You see Uncle Sam in the back cheering, but you see Theodore Roosevelt on the right. You see the country of Colombia on the left. Prom date question. If you enjoyed going to the prom with males, who would you prefer to go to the prom with? That handsome, strong, rugged U.S. Theodore Roosevelt, or that disgusting, ugly, little, fat, greasy, ugly, horrifying Colombian? Obviously, this is a pro-U.S., pro-Theodore Roosevelt cartoon. What's happening here? China. Who are these figures in the front, and who's screaming in the back? Well, obviously, you're seeing China back there screaming. As what is being divided up by a pizza pie, like a pizza pie? China. Queen Victoria of England. Germany. The Russian Tsar with the little mustache there. French Lady Liberty looking over the shoulder. And who is that other divider of the pizza on the right? That, of course, is Japan. China is being divided up into spheres of influence. Love this one. This is our last one, so I'll say goodbye to you right now and then sign off. Well, first of all, on the right, that one's pretty obvious. Who is being represented? Poor, sad China. Who has got China locked up, shackled? The Russians, the Germans, the English, the French, the Japanese. The one on the left I absolutely love. Who do you see in the eye of the world? You see a big, strong, powerful Russia. That's 1904. There's a little figure way in the background. I don't know who that is. Let's hop, notice the title, In the World's Eye to 1905. Who is this in the front? That was Japan. Big, strong, mighty, powerful. Where is Russia gone? Oh my goodness, little, tiny, weak, scraggly, bearded Russia. Please answer me this question. Why in the world's eye has Russia gone from being powerful in 1904 and Japan not even worth thinking about? Yet a year later, Japan is being seen as powerful, strong, and Russia is this pathetic little creature. What changed? What changed? See you in class.